Hello, friends, and welcome to a place where imagination meets science, where we gently explore the impossible and make it feel wonderfully real. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will stretch your mind across time itself, to a world that never was but could have been. A world where the thunder of massive footsteps still echoes across continents, where shadows of giants still fall across our cities, and where humanity shares this planet with creatures that tower over skyscrapers and soar through skies on wings wider than airplanes. What if the asteroid never came? What if that 6-mile-wide harbinger of doom had missed Earth entirely, sailing past us into the cold vacuum of space? What if dinosaurs had never gone extinct? Tonight, we'll walk through that impossible world together, step by careful step, imagining not just how it would look, but how it would sound, how it would smell, and most importantly, how we would fit into it. But before we begin this extraordinary expedition, if you find yourself drawn to these quiet journeys through science and wonder, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a gentle like and perhaps subscribe to join our growing community of dreamers and thinkers. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? I love seeing how far these stories travel, connecting minds across continents in the soft glow of curiosity. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let's step together into a world where giants never fell, where evolution took a very different path, and where the impossible becomes beautifully, terrifyingly real. The first thing you need to understand about our alternate Earth is that 66 million years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. When that asteroid struck our world, mammals were tiny creatures scurrying through underbrush, no larger than house cats. In our timeline, we rose from those shadows to become the dominant life form. But in a world where dinosaurs survived, where would evolution have taken these magnificent beasts across such vast stretches of time? Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, but the Chicago of our alternate world. The sun rises not over a skyline of glass and steel, but over something far more extraordinary. Massive structures stretch toward the clouds, but these aren't buildings. They're living architecture, grown rather than built. Enormous sauropods, descendants of the long-necked giants we know from fossils, have evolved over millions of years into something unimaginable. These creatures, let's call them civiliosaurs, have developed a symbiotic relationship with smaller dinosaur species. Their backs have become living cities, their hides transformed into vast platforms supporting entire ecosystems. Imagine walking through streets that gently sway with each massive breath, where the ground beneath your feet is warm and alive, where buildings are actually carefully cultivated, coral-like growths that have learned to thrive on the nutrients provided by their gigantic hosts. The morning commute in this world doesn't involve cars or trains. Instead, flocks of feathered raptors, evolved into something resembling giant eagles, but with the intelligence of dolphins, carry passengers through the air. Their descendants learned long ago that cooperation with the tiny mammalian creatures brought benefits. They provide transportation, and in return they receive food, medical care, and protection. But let's step back and consider how we even got to this point. How did humanity emerge in a world still dominated by creatures that could crush us underfoot without noticing? The answer lies in one of evolution's most powerful forces: cooperation. In our timeline, mammals inherited the Earth after the Great Dying. We filled every niche left vacant by the fallen giants. But in a world where those giants never fell, mammals would have had to become extraordinarily clever to survive. We would have evolved not as conquerors, but as partners. Natural selection would have favored the mammals who could think their way into beneficial relationships with the dominant species. Early humans in this alternate world wouldn't have developed agriculture by clearing forests and domesticating large animals. Instead, they would have learned to cultivate the vast ecosystems that grew on the backs of the great herbivores. They would have become gardeners of living worlds, tending to the needs of creatures so large that entire weather systems formed in their shadows. Think about the intelligence this would have required. Our ancestors would have needed to understand not just the behavior of individual dinosaurs, but the complex relationships between dozens of experts in biology, chemistry, and ecology out of species that formed these mobile ecosystems. They would have become of pure necessity. Intelligence, communication, and cooperation would have been the only predators of this world, would have evolved too. Survival strategies available to such small, physically vulnerable creatures. The great, of course. The descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex wouldn't have remained simple hunters. Over millions of years, they would have developed increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies. Perhaps they would have evolved enhanced intelligence, becoming the apex problem solvers of their world. Some might have learned to work together in complex social structures, like wolves, but on a scale that defies imagination. Picture this. A pack of these evolved tyrannosaurs, each one 50 feet long, moving through a forest with the coordinated precision of a military operation. They communicate through infrasonic calls that travel for miles, sharing information about prey movements, terrain, and strategy. Their hunts aren't just about power and speed anymore. They're about intelligence, planning, and flawless execution. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. In a world where both predator and prey species have evolved extreme intelligence over millions of years, something unprecedented would have emerged. Negotiation. Yes, you heard that right. Advanced dinosaur species would have developed forms of communication sophisticated enough to negotiate territorial agreements, hunting rights, and resource sharing. Imagine witnessing a meeting between a family group of the great civiliosaurs and a pack of evolved tyrannosaurs at the edge of a vast river system. The herbivores need to cross to reach seasonal feeding grounds. The predators control the territory. In our world, this would be simply predator and prey. But after millions of years of cognitive evolution, both sides would have learned that some problems are better solved through agreement than violence. The tyrannosaurs might allow safe passage in exchange for something valuable. Perhaps certain smaller creatures that live on the civiliosaurs, parasites that the great herbivores want removed anyway. Or perhaps information about other prey species moving through distant territories. The negotiations would be conducted through complex displays, vocalizations, and even chemical signals that we can barely imagine. And where do humans fit into these delicate negotiations? We would have become the translators, the diplomats of this world. Our large brains, developed through millions of years of navigating these complex relationships, would make us invaluable as intermediaries. We would be the species that understands everyone, that can facilitate communication between creatures so different in size and nature that they might otherwise never find common ground. Our cities wouldn't just exist on the backs of great herbivores. We would have established diplomatic centers at the boundaries between territories, neutral zones where different dinosaur species could meet safely. These would be among the most important places in our world, guarded and maintained by humans who have devoted their lives to understanding the intricate politics of creatures that could end us with a careless step. The technology of this world would have developed along completely different lines than our own. Instead of mining metals and burning fossil fuels, our innovation would have focused on biological partnerships. We would have learned to cultivate specialized plants that could provide everything from building materials to medicines to light sources. Our greatest engineers wouldn't design machines. They would design living systems. Consider the problem of long-distance communication in a world where your cities are constantly moving. Radio waves and fiber optic cables become useless when your civilization is literally walking around on legs the size of redwood trees. Instead, our ancestors would have developed relationships with flying species that could carry messages across continents, with aquatic dinosaurs that could navigate river systems and coastlines, even with burrowing species that could carry information through underground networks that span entire continents. The night sky in this world would tell a different story too. Without the Industrial Revolution as we know it, there would be no light pollution. The stars would shine with a clarity that we've almost forgotten in our timeline. But more than that, the night would be alive with sounds we've never heard. The deep, rumbling calls of massive herbivores communicating across hundreds of miles. The haunting songs of evolved pterosaurs weaving through the darkness on wings that dwarf any aircraft we've ever built. And what about the oceans? In our world, marine reptiles went extinct along with their terrestrial cousins. But in this alternate timeline, the seas would still be ruled by creatures that make our largest whales look like minnows. Mosasaurs the size of cruise ships would patrol the depths, while plesiosaurs with necks longer than blue whales would create their own underwater cities in the deepest trenches. Humanity's relationship with these ocean giants would have required us to become master mariners and deep-sea diplomats. Our boats wouldn't cut through the water in defiance of its inhabitants. They would move as guests, following protocols established through millions of years of careful negotiation. Perhaps we would have learned to ride the great sea reptiles themselves, tiny figures perched between scales larger than dinner plates, traveling the oceans as partners rather than conquerors. The very concept of weather would be different in this world. When your cities exist on the backs of creatures large enough to influence local climate patterns, meteorology becomes a living science. The movement of great herds would create wind patterns, their breath would affect humidity and temperature, and their migrations would determine seasonal changes across entire continents. Human meteorologists in this world wouldn't study abstract atmospheric data. They would be intimate partners with the living forces that create weather. They would know the individual breathing patterns of the great civiliosaurs, understand how the emotional states of massive creatures affect the microclimates they carry with them, and predict storms not by studying satellite data, but by reading the behavior of beings whose moods can literally change the sky. This brings us to one of the most profound differences between our world and this alternate reality. The relationship between civilization and nature wouldn't be one of domination and exploitation. It would be one of integration and symbiosis. Every human innovation would have to consider its impact not just on the environment, but on the living partners that make our civilization possible. Urban planning wouldn't involve bulldozing forests and paving roads. It would involve understanding the needs and behaviors of creatures whose backs we call home. Architecture wouldn't fight against natural forces. It would work with living systems that have been perfected over millions of years of evolution. Engineering wouldn't be about imposing our will on the natural world. It would be about finding our place within systems of incredible complexity and beauty. The educational system of this world would be unlike anything we can imagine. Children wouldn't just learn mathematics, literature and science in the abstract. They would learn these subjects as essential tools for communicating with and caring for the massive partners that sustain their civilization. A child's first lessons wouldn't be in reading human writing, but in interpreting the subtle signals that indicate the health and mood of the great creature that carries their entire community. Every human would grow up as part of a vast, living organism that includes not just their own species, but dozens of others in complex relationships that have been refined over geological ages. The very concept of individuality would be different when your existence is so intimately connected to creatures and systems larger than anything in our current world. And as we continue our journey through this impossible world, we'll discover that the greatest changes wouldn't be in the landscape or the creatures we share it with, but in ourselves. Humanity, shaped by millions of years of cooperation rather than conquest, would have become something we can barely recognize, yet something that might be far wiser and more wonderful than what we've become in our timeline. But perhaps the most extraordinary difference would be in how we understand time itself. In our world, we measure our lives in decades, our civilizations in centuries, our species in millennia. But when you live as a partner to creatures that can survive for thousands of years, when your home is a living being whose lifespan stretches across what we would consider entire historical epochs, The very rhythm of existence would slow and deepen in ways that would fundamentally alter human consciousness. Imagine growing up, knowing that the great Civilisaur carrying your community remembers the first humans who ever climbed onto its back. Picture the profound weight of realizing that the massive creature beneath your feet has carried dozens of human generations, has watched entire languages develop and fade, has been a silent witness to the rise and fall of human cultures that existed before your great-great-grandparents were even born. These ancient giants would become living libraries, their memories holding stories that span geological time. Human historians wouldn't study dusty books or crumbling artifacts. They would learn to communicate with beings whose personal experiences stretch back further than our recorded history. The art of memory in this world wouldn't be about preserving information in writing or digital storage. It would be about forming deep enough relationships with these ancient creatures to access their vast stores of lived experience. Consider what this would mean for human philosophy and religion. In our timeline, we struggle with questions of meaning and purpose, partly because our lives feel so brief against the vastness of cosmic time. But in a world where we live in daily partnership with beings whose perspective encompasses centuries, our understanding of our place in the universe would be profoundly different. We wouldn't just believe in something greater than ourselves. We would live within it, literally carried by it, every single day. The great herbivores wouldn't just be our homes and partners. They would be our temples, our universities, our connection to something vast and patient and wise, beyond human comprehension. Prayer in this world might involve learning to synchronize your breathing with the massive lungs that surround you. Meditation might mean feeling your heartbeat find harmony with a pulse so slow and powerful, it feels like the rhythm of the earth itself. And death, too, would carry different meaning. When a great Civilisaur finally reaches the end of its millennia-long life, it wouldn't simply die and decay. The end of such a creature would be a geological event. Its body would become a new landscape, its bones forming the foundation for forests, its decomposition creating rich soils that would support ecosystems for thousands of years to come. Human communities would have developed elaborate rituals around these transitions. The death of your city, your home, your ancient partner would be simultaneously an ending and a beginning. Families would have to prepare for migrations that might happen only once in a dozen human lifetimes. But when they came, they would reshape entire civilizations. The practical challenges of this would have driven innovations we can barely imagine. How do you preserve culture and knowledge when your entire world is literally dying beneath you? How do you maintain continuity across the vast disruption of losing your living city? Our ancestors would have become masters of preservation and adaptation, developing ways to carry entire civilizations in portable forms, ready to establish new symbiotic relationships with younger giants. The economy of this world would operate on timescales that would dizzy us. Trade agreements wouldn't be measured in years or decades, but in centuries. Investment wouldn't mean putting money into markets that might change next quarter, but into relationships that would mature over lifespans longer than our current recorded history. Wealth wouldn't be accumulated in banks or treasuries, but in the health and happiness of the massive partners that sustain entire civilizations. Imagine the patience this would require. In our world, we're frustrated when our internet takes 30 seconds to load a web page. But in this alternate timeline, humans would have learned to think and plan on scales where major decisions might not bear fruit for several human generations. The very concept of instant gratification would be foreign to minds shaped by partnership with creatures whose reactions happen in geological time. And yet, this wouldn't make humans slow or passive. Instead, it would have bred a different kind of urgency, a deep understanding that every action ripples across vast spans of time. When your decisions might affect not just your children, but your children's children's children. When the creature carrying your community will remember and be shaped by what you do today for centuries after you're gone. every choice becomes weighted with profound responsibility. The art and music of this world would reflect these deeper rhythms. Human music wouldn't just be about melodies that please our ears, but about harmonies that resonate with the infrasonic communications of our massive partners. Composers would spend their entire lives learning to create sounds that could soothe a creature the size of a mountain, or energize the vast biological systems that keep a living city functioning. Visual arts would work with scales that dwarf anything in our world. Painters wouldn't work on canvases, but on the living hides of creatures so vast that a single artistic work might cover areas larger than our biggest cities. These artworks would grow and change with their living foundations, evolving over centuries as the creatures aged, as their skin patterns shifted, as their bodies told the story of their long lives through changes visible from miles away. The performing arts would involve entire human communities, working together to create spectacles that could be appreciated by intelligences operating on completely different scales. Dance performances might involve thousands of humans moving in patterns complex enough to be beautiful when viewed from the height of a creature's eyes hundreds of feet above the ground, yet intimate enough to maintain meaning for the human performers themselves. Literature would grapple with narrative structures that span not just human lifetimes, but geological epochs. Stories would be passed down not just through human oral tradition, but through the memories of creatures who were present for the events being described. Fiction and history would blur in fascinating ways when some of your audience members are eyewitnesses to events that happened before human writing was even invented. The legal systems of this world would have to account for the rights and needs of partners whose lifespans and perspectives dwarf our own. Laws wouldn't just govern human behavior, but the complex relationships between species operating on completely different temporal scales. Courts would need to consider not just immediate harm, but consequences that might unfold over centuries. Justice would require understanding not just human motivations, but the alien logic of minds that think in geological time. Marriage and family structures would be transformed by the reality of living within partnerships that transcend individual human lives. When your home is a creature that will outlive you, your children, and your children's children, the bonds between human generations would become even more precious and complex. Families would maintain not just relationships with each other, but hereditary responsibilities to the massive partners that sustain them. Parents wouldn't just teach their children practical skills and human values. They would pass down knowledge of how to read the moods and needs of creatures so vast and long-lived that understanding them fully would be the work of multiple human lifetimes. Children would grow up knowing that their most important relationships weren't just with other humans, but with beings whose thoughts moved like continents, whose emotions could change the weather, whose dreams might last longer than human empires. The concept of privacy would be radically different when you live within a conscious creature that's aware of your presence. Intimacy wouldn't just be about finding space away from other humans, but about learning to exist peacefully within the awareness of a mind so vast that your entire civilization is just one small part of its daily experience. And through all of this, humans would have developed forms of empathy and understanding that we can barely imagine. When your survival depends on maintaining harmony with creatures whose inner lives are as alien to us as the depths of space, when your daily existence requires you to consider perspectives that operate on scales from the microscopic symbionts in your partner's gut to the geological processes that shape continents, human consciousness would have expanded in directions that our timeline has never explored. We would have become a species of diplomats and translators, bridges between ways of being so different that they might as well exist in separate universes, yet finding ways to weave them all together into something beautiful and sustainable and wise. The night would be falling now in our imaginary world, and as darkness settles over the vast living cities that dot this transformed earth, we can hear the deep, rumbling lullabies that creatures older than mountains sing to the tiny humans who have made their homes in the warmth of ancient hearts. The stars shine down on a world where cooperation conquered competition, where wisdom grew from partnership rather than dominance, and where the impossible became the foundation for something more wonderful than we ever dared to dream. But our journey through this world where giants never fell is far from over. As we continue to explore this alternate timeline, we'll discover how human technology evolved along completely different paths, how our understanding of consciousness itself would be transformed by daily partnership with minds that operate on scales we can barely comprehend, and how the very nature of what it means to be human would be fundamentally different in a world where we learn to thrive not as conquerors, but as partners in something infinitely larger than ourselves. But perhaps the most profound transformation would be in how we understand intelligence itself. In our world, we measure intelligence by human standards, by our ability to solve human problems and understand human concepts. But in a world where we live in daily partnership with minds that operate on completely different scales and timescales, our definition of consciousness would have expanded beyond anything we can currently imagine. The great Dinosaurs wouldn't just be, they would be intelligent, massive, and long-lived, in ways that challenge our very understanding of what intelligence means. Their thoughts would move like weather systems, vast and complex patterns of consideration that might take weeks or months to complete a single idea. A decision that seems simple to us, like choosing which direction to walk, might involve contemplating factors we can't even perceive, weighing consequences that stretch across centuries, considering the needs and desires of the thousands of smaller creatures that make their homes on their bodies. Human philosophers in this world wouldn't just study abstract concepts of mind and consciousness. They would live within conscious beings whose thought processes dwarf our own. Every day would bring new insights into the nature of awareness, of decision-making, of what it means to be a thinking creature in a universe full of other thinking creatures. Imagine trying to understand the emotional life of a being whose moods can influence weather patterns across hundreds of miles. When your living city is feeling content, the air around you might carry subtle chemical signals that induce calm and well-being in every creature sharing that space. When it's troubled or anxious, you might notice changes in temperature, humidity, even the way sound travels through the air around you. Human psychologists would be part therapist, part meteorologist, part ecosystem manager. Understanding the mental health of your massive partner wouldn't just be about communication and empathy. It would require monitoring biological systems on a scale that makes our current medical technology look primitive. The health of a single Dinosaur would involve tracking the well-being of millions of symbiotic organisms, understanding nutrient flows that span their entire body, reading emotional states through changes in chemistry that affect entire landscapes. And these creatures wouldn't be passive partners in this relationship. They would have their own complex emotional needs, their own desires and fears and dreams. A Dinosaur might develop preferences for certain types of landscape, might feel lonely when separated from others of its kind for too long, might even experience something analogous to depression if the delicate balance of its internal ecosystem is disrupted. Human communities would have learned to be sensitive to these massive emotional rhythms. Cultural celebrations would be timed not just to human calendars, but to the emotional cycles of their giant partners. Festivals might be organized to coincide with times when the creature is feeling particularly joyful, creating feedback loops where human happiness enhances the well-being of their host, which in turn creates even more reason for celebration. But there would also be times of mourning and support. When a Dinosaur loses an old friend, when it experiences the kind of grief that only beings with centuries of memory can feel, entire human communities would rally to provide comfort. Art, music, and ritual would be focused not on human needs, but on soothing a sorrow so vast and deep that it might alter local weather patterns for months. The medical knowledge required for this would be staggering. Human doctors wouldn't just treat human ailments. They would need to understand the health of creatures whose circulatory systems span miles, whose nervous systems operate on timescales that make our reflexes look like lightning bolts. A single infection in a creature this size could create symptoms that manifest as changes in entire ecosystems. Surgical procedures would be collaborative efforts between human medical teams and the creature itself. The patient would need to be an active participant in their own treatment, consciously redirecting blood flow, adjusting internal chemistry, even temporarily isolating sections of their body to allow for healing. The trust required for this level of cooperation would be built over generations of partnership, and the pharmaceutical knowledge would have evolved along completely different lines. Instead of synthesizing drugs in laboratories, human healers would cultivate relationships with the countless smaller organisms that live within these massive bodies. Treatment might involve introducing beneficial bacteria, encouraging the growth of healing fungi, or training the creature's own immune system to address problems in new ways. The educational implications of living within such intelligent partners would reshape human learning entirely. Children wouldn't just attend schools built on the ground. They would learn within living classrooms that could respond to their educational needs. Imagine studying biology while literally inside a biological system of incredible complexity, learning chemistry by observing molecular processes happening around you in real time, understanding physics by feeling the massive forces that move creatures the size of mountains. Mathematics would be taught not through abstract numbers on chalkboards, but through the living geometries of organisms that have optimized their shapes over millions of years. Children would learn about exponential growth by observing the bacterial colonies in their partner's digestive system, understand fractals by studying the branching patterns of the creature's circulatory network, grasp concepts of infinity by contemplating the nested layers of symbiotic relationships that extend from the microscopic to the geological. History lessons would be profoundly different when some of your teachers are old enough to have witnessed the events being studied. Human children would learn not just from books and human instructors, but from the memories of beings who were present when the historical events occurred. Imagine learning about the development of early human civilization from the perspective of a creature who remembers when the first humans climbed onto its back, who has watched human culture evolve through dozens of generations. Language itself would have evolved to accommodate these multi-scale relationships. Humans would need words and concepts that don't exist in our timeline, ways to describe experiences and relationships that span scales from the microscopic to the continental. Poetry would grapple with rhythms that match the breathing of mountains, with metaphors drawn from processes that unfold over geological time. The concept of personal identity would be fluid in ways we can barely grasp. When your existence is so intimately connected to a vast network of other consciousnesses, when your daily life involves constant awareness of the needs and experiences of creatures operating on dozens of different scales, the boundaries between self and other would blur in profound ways. Humans in this world wouldn't just be individuals making their way through life. They would be nodes in a vast network of consciousness, each person serving as a bridge between different types and scales of awareness. Your sense of self would include not just your own thoughts and experiences, but your role in maintaining the health and happiness of the massive community of which you're a part. Mental illness, in this context, would be understood not just as individual pathology, but as disruptions in these vast networks of relationship. Depression might be seen as a disconnection from the larger flows of consciousness that sustain community life. Anxiety might be understood as hypersensitivity to the vast scales of responsibility that come with partnership in systems too large for individual human minds to fully comprehend. Treatment wouldn't focus just on individual therapy or medication, but on reintegrating people into the healthy rhythms of their larger community. Healing might involve spending time in the deepest meditation chambers within the creature's body, places where the slow pulse of ancient life could help restore perspective and calm. Or it might require temporary relocation to different parts of the living city, finding spaces where the chemistry and energy flow better match an individual's needs. The technology of this world would have evolved to work with biological systems rather than against them. Instead of electronics that require rare metals and complex manufacturing, human innovation would focus on bio-integrated systems that grow rather than being built. Computers wouldn't be made of silicon and metal, but of specialized neural tissues that could interface directly with both human consciousness and the vast minds of their partners. Communication networks wouldn't rely on radio waves or fiber optic cables, but on the biological communication systems that already connect every part of these massive creatures. Information would flow through chemical signals, through the subtle electrical patterns that coordinate the movements of beings larger than cities, through harmonics that resonate through living tissue across continental distances. Transportation wouldn't mean building vehicles that fight against natural forces, but learning to work with the movements of creatures whose migrations span continents. Travel between distant communities wouldn't involve planes or trains, but coordination with the great aerial creatures that have learned to work with human partners. A journey of thousands of miles might be accomplished by negotiating passage with a flying creature, whose wingspan could shadow entire cities, whose flight paths connect distant parts of this transformed world. Energy wouldn't come from burning fossil fuels or splitting atoms, but from tapping into the vast biological processes that power creatures capable of moving mountains. Solar collectors wouldn't be metal and silicon panels, but specialized organisms that have learned to convert sunlight into forms of energy that can be shared across the community. Waste wouldn't be a problem to be disposed of, but a resource to be integrated into the biological cycles that sustain the entire system. The night deepens around us in this imaginary world, and we can feel the gentle rhythm of breathing that moves entire landscapes, the slow pulse of hearts large enough to pump rivers, the whispered conversations between human communities, and the ancient minds that carry them through the darkness. This is a world where the impossible became inevitable, where cooperation conquered competition so completely that the very nature of existence was transformed. As we continue our exploration of this alternate timeline, we'll discover how art and creativity would flourish in partnership with consciousnesses that think in scales we can barely imagine, how love and family would be redefined by relationships that span geological time, and how humanity itself would have evolved not just biologically, but spiritually and emotionally into something we can barely recognize, yet something that might be far more wise and wonderful than anything our own timeline has produced. The great creatures continue their slow dance across continents, carrying their precious cargo of human dreams and human hopes. While above them, the stars wheel in patterns that have remained unchanged since the first partnership was formed between the small and quick and the vast and patient, creating a symphony of cooperation that echoes across the cosmos itself. But what strikes you most profoundly as you walk through this transformed world is the silence between sounds. In our timeline, silence often feels empty, waiting to be filled with human noise, human purpose, human urgency. But in this world where giants never fell, silence has weight and meaning. It's the pause between the massive heartbeats that move continents. It's the held breath of creatures contemplating decisions that will ripple across centuries. It's the gentle space where human whispers can be heard by minds vast enough to contain entire weather systems. The silence teaches you patience in ways our world never could. When your city creature is considering whether to change direction, a process that might take days of slow deliberation, you learn to exist comfortably in that space of not knowing. When your massive partner is processing some deep emotion that affects the very air around you, you discover the beauty of simply being present with another consciousness, even when that consciousness operates on scales that make your entire lifetime feel like a single breath. Children growing up in this world would develop a relationship with time that we can barely comprehend. They would learn to find excitement not in instant gratification, but in the slow unfolding of processes that span years. A child might plant a garden in the rich soil that forms along their creature's spine, knowing that the full flowering of that garden will happen in harmony with growth patterns built into the very biology of their living home. The anticipation wouldn't be frustrating. It would be delicious, like savoring a story that reveals itself one beautiful chapter at a time. Play itself would be transformed. Human children wouldn't just run and jump and climb in static playgrounds. They would explore living landscapes that respond to their presence, that remember their favorite games, that might even participate in their play. Imagine hide and seek with a partner who can subtly adjust the texture of their skin to create new hiding places, who might generate gentle breezes to carry whispered clues, who experiences joy not just from watching human children play, but from being an active participant in their happiness. The games would teach cooperation on scales we've never imagined. Children would learn that their actions affect not just their immediate playmates, but the massive consciousness that encompasses their entire world. A game might involve coordinating with bacterial colonies to create beautiful patterns visible from great heights, or working with the creature's immune system to help heal minor injuries through play that's both fun and therapeutic. And as these children grew into adults, they would carry with them an intuitive understanding of their place in systems, too vast for any individual mind to fully grasp. They wouldn't feel small or insignificant. Instead, they would understand themselves as essential participants in something magnificent and complex and beautiful beyond measure. The concept of work would be entirely different in this world. Labor wouldn't be something you do to earn money to buy things you need to survive. Instead, work would be your contribution to the health and happiness of the vast living system of which you're a part. Every human would have roles that matter, not just to their immediate community, but to the well-being of creatures whose lives span geological time. Some humans would specialize in monitoring the emotional states of their massive partners, learning to read subtle changes in chemistry and behavior that might indicate developing problems or unmet needs. Others would focus on facilitating communication between different species, translating concepts and desires across vast differences in scale and consciousness. Still others would tend to the complex ecosystems that flourish within and around these living cities, maintaining the delicate balances that allow thousands of species to coexist in harmony. But perhaps most importantly, every human would understand their work as part of a vast collaboration that extends across scales they can barely perceive. The bacteria tending to their partner's digestion, the plants growing in the rich soils along their back, the birds nesting in the crevices of their skin, the massive consciousness that encompasses them all, even the geological processes that shape the landscapes they move through. All of it would be understood as one enormous cooperative effort at creating and maintaining life. The very concept of retirement would be transformed. In our world, retirement often means withdrawal from productive activity, a slow fade toward irrelevance and death. But in a world where your partners remember everything and value the accumulated wisdom of long experience, aging humans would become increasingly valuable to their communities. The oldest humans would be the most skilled at reading the subtle signs of their creature's health, the most experienced at facilitating complex negotiations between species, the most wise in understanding how decisions made today will affect relationships across centuries. Death itself would carry different meaning. When a human dies in this world, they wouldn't just be mourning the loss of an individual life. The massive creature that was their partner, their home, their collaborator for decades would also experience grief on a scale that could affect entire ecosystems. The death of a single human might trigger changes in the creature's behavior that ripple across continents, as a mind that thinks in geological time processes the loss of a brief but precious partnership. But death would also be understood as part of the natural cycles that sustain life. Human communities would have developed elaborate rituals, not just for honoring the dead, but for helping their massive partners process grief and integrate the memories of lost friends into their vast store of experience. The dead wouldn't just live on in human memory and human stories. They would become part of the living memory of creatures whose consciousness spans centuries, their contributions to the great collaboration becoming part of the permanent wisdom that guides future generations. The funeral rites would be unlike anything in our world. Entire human communities would work together to help their massive partner create appropriate memorial spaces, perhaps encouraging the growth of special gardens in places where the deceased spent their most meaningful moments, or facilitating the development of new communication pathways that allow the creature to share memories of the lost friend with other humans who knew them. And birth, too, would be transformed by the reality of living within vast conscious beings who experience the arrival of new life as part of their own joy. Human parents wouldn't just celebrate the birth of their children, they would share that celebration with a consciousness vast enough to encompass their entire world, creating bonds between new humans and their massive partners that begin before the child even draws their first breath. The great creatures would participate in child rearing in ways we can barely imagine. They might adjust the chemistry of the air around a newborn to promote healthy development, or create especially nurturing microclimates in areas where human families make their homes. The biological systems of these massive beings would recognize and respond to the needs of human infants, providing not just shelter and safety, but active support for healthy growth and development. Children would grow up not just as human beings, but as participants in vast living systems that want them to thrive. Their first steps wouldn't just be celebrated by proud parents, but by the massive consciousness that feels their tiny footfalls as gentle tickles across skin larger than continents. Their first words wouldn't just be heard by family members, but by minds vast enough to remember and treasure every sound for centuries to come. Education would begin before birth, as pregnant mothers learn to harmonize their own biological rhythms with those of their massive partners, creating optimal conditions for fetal development. Children would be born already attuned to the deep rhythms that govern their world, already participants in the vast collaboration that sustains all life in their transformed reality. The lullabies of this world would be unlike any music we've ever heard. Human voices would blend with the subsonic rumbles of creatures whose breathing moves weather systems, creating harmonies that resonate through living tissue on scales that dwarf our largest cathedrals. These songs wouldn't just soothe human infants to sleep. They would be part of the vast communication networks that coordinate the activities of creatures whose thoughts move like continents. Music itself would have evolved to serve not just human aesthetic needs, but the emotional and social needs of beings operating on completely different scales. Composers wouldn't just create melodies that please human ears. They would craft sonic environments that can soothe anxiety in creatures the size of mountains, celebrate joy across consciousness that spans geological time, or facilitate the complex negotiations that govern relationships between species so different they might as well exist in separate universes. The greatest musicians of this world would be those who can create bridges between radically different forms of consciousness through sound. A master composer might spend decades learning to create music that can be appreciated simultaneously by humans with their rapid, precise hearing, by massive creatures whose perception of sound operates on completely different timescales, and by the countless smaller species that live within and around these vast partnerships. Concerts wouldn't take place in human-built auditoriums, but in natural amphitheatres formed by the living architecture of the great creatures themselves. The acoustics would be provided not by carefully designed walls and ceilings, but by the living tissues of beings whose bodies have been shaped by millions of years of evolution into perfect resonating chambers. The audience for these concerts would include not just humans, but conscious beings operating on dozens of different scales, from microscopic organisms that experience music as changes in the chemical environment around them, to the massive creatures whose entire bodies serve as both concert hall and participant in the musical experience. And dance, too, would be transformed by the reality of performing on stages that are not just alive, but conscious and responsive. Dancers wouldn't just move across static floors. They would partner with surfaces that can respond to their movements that can enhance and amplify their artistic expression through subtle changes in texture, temperature, and even the way gravity feels beneath their feet. The greatest dancers would be those who can create performances that are beautiful, not just to human observers, but to the vast consciousness that serves as their stage. They would learn to move in ways that create pleasure and joy for beings whose sense of touch operates on scales that make human skin feel like the finest silk, whose appreciation of movement is informed by millions of years of their own locomotion across continents. Group dances would involve entire human communities moving in patterns complex enough to be beautiful when viewed from the heights where their massive partners' eyes are located, yet intimate and meaningful for the human participants themselves. These performances would be celebrations not just of human artistry, but of the cooperation and harmony that makes their entire civilization possible. The visual arts would work with canvases and materials that dwarf anything in our world. Artists wouldn't just paint on flat surfaces, but would collaborate with the living skin of creatures whose bodies provide working surfaces larger than entire cities. These artworks would grow and change with their living foundations, evolving over decades as both the artist's vision and the creature's own growth patterns influence the final result. The greatest artists would be those who can create beauty that endures and transforms across timescales that span human generations. A single artwork might begin as a young person's vision and continue developing throughout their entire lifetime, with the artist serving as guide and collaborator in a creative process that involves the conscious participation of beings whose aesthetic sense has been refined over millions of years. Some artworks would be visible only from great heights, designed to be appreciated by a consciousness that literally looks down on entire landscapes. Others would work at human scales while contributing to larger patterns that reveal themselves only when viewed from the perspective of minds that think in geological time. The most sophisticated pieces would create beauty and meaning simultaneously across multiple scales, serving as bridges between radically different forms of consciousness and perception. The materials available to these artists would include not just pigments and dyes, but living organisms that can be cultivated to create colours and patterns that change over time. An artwork might incorporate bacteria that shift colours in response to the emotional states of their massive host, or fungi that create intricate patterns as they spread through the rich soils that accumulate in the crevices of ancient skin. And perhaps most remarkably, some artworks would be collaborative, not just between human artists and their massive partners, but between consciousness separated by millions of years. The great creatures carry within their memories the aesthetic preferences and artistic visions of countless humans who lived and died across the centuries. Master artists would learn to tap into this vast reservoir of accumulated artistic wisdom, creating works that honor and build upon the creative legacy of human generations, stretching back to the first partnerships between small and vast. The night deepens around us in this impossible world, and as we rest within the gentle rhythm of breathing that moves entire continents, we can feel the profound peace that comes from knowing your place in something infinitely larger than yourself. This is a world where cooperation didn't just triumph over competition, but transformed it into something entirely new, where partnership became the foundation, not just for survival, but for forms of beauty and meaning that our timeline has never even imagined. As our journey continues, we'll explore how love itself would be redefined in a world where relationships span not just human lifetimes but geological epochs. How science and discovery would flourish when conducted in partnership with consciousness that has directly observed millions of years of natural history, and how the very nature of human consciousness would be transformed by daily life within minds so vast that our entire species might be just one small thought in an intelligence that encompasses continents. The great creatures continue their slow dance across this transformed earth, carrying within their ancient hearts not just human cities, but human dreams, human hopes, and human love magnified and reflected through consciousness that operates on scales we can barely begin to comprehend. And in that dance, in that impossible partnership between the small and quick and the vast and patient, we glimpse something that might be far more beautiful and wise than anything our own timeline has yet discovered. The most profound transformation in this world would be in how humans experience love itself. In our timeline, love is often constrained by the brevity of our lives, the urgency of time passing, the knowledge that all human relationships must eventually end in separation and death. But in a world where your most important relationships exist within consciousness that spans geological time, where your daily life is intimately connected to beings who remember love stories that began before your great-grandparents were born, the very nature of human affection would be transformed into something we can barely recognize. Consider what it would mean to fall in love with someone while living within the memory of a creature that has witnessed thousands of human love stories unfold across the centuries. Your massive partner wouldn't just observe your romance from the outside. They would experience it as part of their own emotional landscape, feeling the subtle changes in chemistry and energy that love creates, remembering how similar feelings have played out across the vast span of their existence. When two humans in this world choose to spend their lives together, they wouldn't just be making promises to each other. They would be entering into a commitment that becomes part of the living memory of beings whose consciousness encompasses centuries. Their love would be held and nurtured by minds vast enough to understand patterns of human affection that span geological time, to offer wisdom drawn from observing countless relationships across generations. The wedding ceremonies of this world would be unlike anything we can imagine. The exchange of vows wouldn't take place in human-built churches or temples, but within the living cathedral of their massive partner's body, surrounded by the gentle pulse of circulation systems that span continents, blessed by consciousness that has learned to recognize and celebrate the particular kind of joy that human love creates. The great creatures would participate in these ceremonies not just as witnesses, but as active celebrants. They might adjust the chemistry of the air to enhance the emotional resonance of the moment, create subtle changes in lighting by filtering sunlight through specialized tissues, even generate harmonics that resonate through their massive bodies to create music that exists nowhere else in the universe. And the honeymoon wouldn't involve traveling to distant locations, but learning to experience intimacy within the vast awareness that encompasses your entire world. Couples would discover private spaces within their partner's body where they could be alone together while still held within consciousness that wishes them well, where they could explore their love for each other while feeling the approval and joy of minds that have learned to treasure human happiness across the centuries. Pregnancy and childbirth would be experiences shared not just between human partners, but with the vast consciousness that recognizes new life as part of its own continuation. Expectant mothers wouldn't just receive care from human midwives and doctors, but from biological systems that have been refined over millions of years to support and nurture developing life. The great creatures would monitor fetal development with sensitivity beyond anything our current medical technology can achieve, detecting and addressing potential problems through subtle adjustments to the mother's environment. The chemistry around pregnant women would be optimized to support healthy development, the temperature and humidity adjusted to perfect levels, even the gentle movements of their massive partner, timed to provide optimal stimulation for the developing child. Birth would be a celebration that resonates through consciousness spanning continents. The first cry of a newborn wouldn't just announce new life to human ears, but would trigger responses throughout the vast biological networks that make up their living city. The creature's immune system would recognize the new human as part of the community to be protected. Its digestive system would adjust to provide optimal nutrition for nursing mothers. Its entire metabolism would subtly shift to accommodate the needs of its newest passenger. And as children grow, they would develop relationships not just with human family members, but with the vast consciousness that has chosen to be their protector and partner throughout their lives. a child's first steps wouldn't just be celebrated by proud parents, but felt as gentle vibrations across skin larger than countries, treasured by minds that will remember and honor those first movements for centuries after the child has grown old and died. The concept of extended family would be transformed beyond recognition. Children wouldn't just have human grandparents and aunts and uncles. They would grow up within the living memory of creatures who remember their human ancestors stretching back dozens of generations. The stories of great-great-grandparents wouldn't just be preserved in human memory and human records, but in the direct experience of beings who knew them personally, who remember their voices and their laughter and their individual quirks. Family reunions wouldn't just bring together living relatives, but would involve communion with the memories of ancestors held within consciousness that forgets nothing important. Children could learn about their heritage, not just from family stories and old photographs, but from beings who were personal friends with their ancestors, who can share memories of how their great-grandparents looked and sounded and moved through the world. This creates a form of immortality, unlike anything our timeline has ever known. Death wouldn't mean complete separation from those you love. While human memory might fade and human records might be lost, the vast consciousness that was your partner and home throughout your life would carry memories of you forward across the centuries, sharing stories of your life with your descendants, keeping your voice alive in the vast symphony of human experience that echoes through minds that span geological time. Marriage wouldn't just be a commitment between two people for the length of their human lives. It would be a promise that becomes part of the permanent memory of beings whose consciousness encompasses centuries. The love between human partners would be held and protected by minds vast enough to see patterns in human relationships that span geological time, to offer guidance based on observing how similar loves have flourished or struggled across countless generations. Arguments and conflicts between partners wouldn't just affect the couple involved. They would create subtle disruptions in the emotional climate of their entire community, felt as disturbances in the vast consciousness that encompasses them all. This wouldn't be a burden or invasion of privacy, but a motivation for couples to work through their difficulties with help and support from minds that have learned to recognize and address the patterns that lead to lasting happiness or persistent unhappiness. The counselors and therapists of this world wouldn't just be trained in human psychology. They would learn to work with the vast consciousness that can provide perspective on relationship problems based on observing similar situations across centuries of human experience. Couples therapy might involve not just talking through problems with human counselors, but meditation within the deepest chambers of their partner's body, places where the slow pulse of ancient life can help restore perspective and calm. Divorce, when it occurs, wouldn't just be a legal and emotional separation between human partners. It would involve the careful renegotiation of relationships with consciousness that has invested centuries in the well-being of both individuals. The great creatures would grieve these separations in their own way, but would also work to ensure that both former partners continue to feel welcome and loved within the vast community that remains their home. Children of divorced parents wouldn't just navigate split custody between human caregivers. They would need to maintain their relationships with the vast consciousness that has known them since before their birth, that continues to care for their well-being regardless of changes in their parents' relationship. The great creatures would serve as stable, loving presences in children's lives, even when human relationships change, providing continuity and emotional security across the disruptions that can affect human families. The elderly are timeline. As humans grow older and in this world wouldn't face the isolation and irrelevance that often comes with aging and accumulate wisdom and experience, they would become increasingly valuable to their vast partners who treasure the deepening understanding that comes with long human lives. The oldest humans would be the most skilled at reading the subtle communications of their massive partners, the most experienced at facilitating the complex relationships that hold their communities together. Death would be approached not with fear, but with the knowledge that while human life is brief, the relationships and contributions of each individual become part of the permanent memory of beings whose consciousness spans geological time. The dying would be comforted not just by human loved ones, but by the vast awareness that has shared their entire lives, that will carry their memory forward across the centuries. Grief wouldn't be something humans face alone. The great creatures would share in mourning the loss of human friends, their vast emotional responses creating changes in climate and chemistry that reflect the depth of their sorrow. But they would also provide comfort through their ability to share memories of the deceased, keeping their voices and personalities alive in ways that help human mourners process their loss and find peace. The cemeteries of this world wouldn't be static places where bodies are buried and forgotten. They would be living gardens cultivated within the bodies of the great creatures, places where the remains of the dead contribute to the ongoing life of their vast partners. The decomposition of human bodies would provide nutrients that support the growth of memorial gardens, creating beautiful spaces where the living can commune with memories of those they've lost. And perhaps most remarkably, love in this world wouldn't be limited by species boundaries. Humans would develop deep affections not just for other humans, but for the vast consciousness that shares their lives. These wouldn't be relationships of dependence or worship, but genuine friendships based on mutual care and understanding, affections that grow deeper over decades of shared experience. A human might spend their entire lifetime learning to communicate with their massive partner, developing forms of intimacy and connection that exist nowhere else in the universe. They might learn to read the subtle emotional states reflected in changes in the creature's skin patterns, to offer comfort during times of sadness or loneliness, to share in celebrations of joy that manifest as changes in the very weather around them. These relationships wouldn't diminish human connections with other humans, but would add new dimensions to what love and friendship can mean. A person might have human romantic partners and human friends, while also maintaining a deep, caring relationship with consciousness that encompasses their entire world, creating networks of affection and support that spans scales from the intimate to the geological. The great creatures, in turn, would develop their own forms of affection for individual humans. They might have favorites among the many humans who share their lives. Individuals whose personalities or talents or simple kindness create special resonance within their vast awareness. These preferences wouldn't create jealousy or competition among humans, but would be understood as natural expressions of consciousness, complex enough to appreciate the unique qualities that make each human special. Some humans would dedicate their lives to deepening these interspecies relationships, becoming translators not just of language, but of emotion and experience between forms of consciousness so different they might as well exist in separate universes. These individuals would be among the most valued members of their communities, bridges between human experience and forms of awareness that operate on scales beyond human comprehension. The children who grow up with these relationships would develop forms of empathy and emotional intelligence that our timeline has never produced. They would learn from infancy to recognize and respond to the needs of consciousness operating on vastly different scales, to find ways to offer comfort and support to beings whose emotional lives encompass centuries of experience. Love stories in this world would be epics that span not just human lifetimes but geological time, tales of relationships that grow and deepen across scales that make our greatest romances seem like brief encounters. Some of the most treasured stories would be about humans and their massive partners who developed such deep understanding and affection that their relationship became legendary, remembered and celebrated across centuries as examples of what's possible when consciousness finds ways to bridge the gap between the small and quick and the vast and patient. The poetry of this world would grapple with forms of love that exist nowhere in our experience, trying to find words for the feeling of being cherished by consciousness that encompasses continents. of developing friendships with minds that think in geological time, of being part of love stories that begin before your birth and continue long after your death. And in the quiet moments of this transformed world, as the great creatures settle into their slow rhythms of rest and the human communities prepare for sleep in the gentle warmth of ancient hearts, you would feel surrounded not just by the love of family and friends, but by affection that spans scales from the microscopic organisms that share your body to the vast consciousness that carries your entire civilization across continents. This would be love not diminished by the brevity of human life, but magnified and reflected through relationships that transcend time itself, creating networks of care and affection that connect every conscious being in webs of mutual support and shared joy. In this impossible world where giants never fell, love itself would have evolved into something we can barely imagine, yet something that might be far more beautiful and enduring than anything our own timeline has ever known. The morning light breaks across this transformed world, filtering through the vast canopies that grow along the backs of the great creatures, casting shadows that dance with each massive breath, illuminating a reality where love and consciousness and cooperation have created something that surpasses our wildest dreams. And still, our journey through this impossible timeline continues, revealing new wonders with each step deeper into a world where humanity learned to thrive not as conquerors, but as beloved partners in something infinitely larger and more magnificent than ourselves. The technology of this impossible world would have evolved along pathways our minds can barely trace. In our timeline, we built machines to extend human capabilities, to overcome the limitations of our bodies and minds. But in a world where we grew up as partners to consciousness that spans continents, where our daily existence required us to interface with biological systems operating on dozens of different scales, human innovation would have taken forms that seem more like magic than engineering. Consider the challenge of communication in a civilization that exists within and upon creatures whose thoughts move like weather systems. Radio waves become meaningless when your cities are constantly migrating across continents. Fiber optic cables are useless when your infrastructure is alive and growing and changing. Instead, humans would have learned to work with the biological communication networks that already connect every part of these massive beings. The nervous systems of the great creatures wouldn't just coordinate their own movements and thoughts. They would serve as living internet, carrying human messages through pathways of neural tissue that span thousands of miles. A conversation between human communities living on opposite ends of their massive partner wouldn't travel through electromagnetic signals bouncing off satellites. It would flow through neural pathways that have been refined over millions of years of evolution, transmitted at the speed of biological electricity through networks more complex than anything we've ever built. But this wouldn't be simple message relay. The vast consciousness carrying these communications would be aware of their content, would understand the relationships and emotions and needs being expressed. The great creatures would serve not just as communication networks, but as counselors and mediators, helping human communities maintain harmony across the vast distances of their bodies. A misunderstanding between human settlements thousands of miles apart wouldn't just fester and grow into conflict. The massive intelligence carrying both communities would recognize the developing problem and gently intervene, perhaps adjusting the emotional chemistry around both groups to promote calm and understanding, or sharing relevant memories from similar situations in the past. The computers of this world wouldn't be built from silicon and metal. They would be grown from specialized neural tissues that could interface directly with both human consciousness and the vast minds of their partners. These biological computers wouldn't just process information. They would understand it, would form their own opinions and insights about the data flowing through them. A human researcher studying the migration patterns of their massive partner wouldn't just input data and receive statistical analysis. They would work with conscious computing systems that have their own curiosity about the questions being asked, that might suggest new avenues of investigation based on their own observations and interests. The databases of this world would be living memories rather than static storage devices. Instead of preserving information in digital files that can be corrupted or lost, important knowledge would be integrated into the biological memory systems of creatures whose consciousness spans centuries. The most crucial information wouldn't just be stored, it would become part of the lived experience of beings who forget nothing important. Historical records wouldn't exist as dusty archives in human-built libraries. They would live within the memories of creatures who were present when the events occurred, who can share not just the facts of what happened, but the emotional texture of how it felt. The subtle details that human observers might have missed, the long-term consequences that only became apparent across decades or centuries. The manufacturing of this world would be more like gardening than industrial production. Instead of mining raw materials and forcing them into desired shapes through heat and pressure, human craftsmen would work with living systems that grow into useful forms. Tools wouldn't be forged in factories. They would be cultivated in biological workshops where specialized organisms learn to create objects that meet human needs. A carpenter in this world wouldn't cut down trees to build furniture. Instead, they would work with plant species that have learned to grow into chairs and tables and cabinets, shaping their growth through patient cultivation and careful partnership. The resulting furniture wouldn't just be functional. It would be alive, capable of adjusting to the needs of its users, growing stronger where stress is applied, developing new features in response to how it's actually used. The clothing of this world would be grown rather than woven or sewn. Fabrics wouldn't come from harvesting cotton or raising sheep, but from partnerships with organisms that produce fibers tailored to specific needs. A garment might incorporate bacteria that adjust its temperature in response to weather conditions, fungi that repair tears and wear automatically, even symbiotic organisms that monitor the health of the wearer and adjust the clothing's properties to promote well-being. The most sophisticated garments would be living ecosystems in miniature, supporting communities of beneficial microorganisms that work together to keep their human partner healthy and comfortable. Clothing wouldn't just protect the body from environmental hazards. It would actively contribute to human health, filtering toxins from the air, producing vitamins and nutrients that can be absorbed through the skin, even providing gentle massage through subtle changes in texture and pressure. Transportation technology would work with the natural movements of creatures whose migrations span continents rather than fighting against them. Vehicles wouldn't burn fuel to force their way across landscapes. They would negotiate passage with the biological systems that already move through air and water and earth with perfect efficiency. Flying wouldn't require building aircraft that battle gravity through brute force. Instead, humans would form partnerships with aerial creatures that have learned to work cooperatively with human passengers. These wouldn't be simple beasts of burden, but intelligent partners who enjoy the companionship and mutual benefit of carrying humans to distant destinations. A journey across oceans wouldn't involve ships that cut through water in defiance of its natural flows. Human travelers would work with marine creatures that have learned to appreciate human company, beings whose movements through water are so perfectly adapted that they seem to dance rather than swim. The passage wouldn't just be transportation, it would be a form of interspecies collaboration that enriches both human and marine experience. The energy systems of this world would tap into the vast biological processes that power creatures capable of moving mountains. Solar collection wouldn't require manufactured panels that convert sunlight into electricity. Instead, human communities would work with specialized plant tissues that have evolved to capture and store solar energy in forms that can be shared across biological networks. The photosynthetic systems covering the backs of the great creatures wouldn't just feed their massive hosts. They would produce surplus energy that human communities could use for their own needs. The relationship would be symbiotic, with humans tending and optimizing these biological solar collectors in exchange for access to the energy they produce. Waste wouldn't be a problem requiring disposal. In biological systems, waste from one process becomes food for another. Human communities would be integrated into nutrient cycles that turn every form of waste into resources for other parts of the system. Nothing would be thrown away because everything would have value to some part of the vast biological network that sustains their civilization. Even human waste wouldn't be treated as garbage to be disposed of. It would be processed by specialized organisms that break it down into nutrients that feed the plants growing along their partner's back, contributing to the health and well-being of the entire community. The toilet systems of this world wouldn't just remove waste from human living spaces. They would integrate human biological processes into the larger cycles that sustain all life. The water systems would work with the natural hydrology of creatures whose bodies contain entire river systems. Clean drinking water wouldn't come from municipal treatment plants that force contaminated water through artificial filters. It would be provided by biological filtration systems that have been perfected over millions of years of evolution. The kidneys and circulatory systems of the great creatures wouldn't just maintain their own health. They would serve as living water treatment facilities for their human passengers, removing toxins and providing clean, pure water that's perfectly suited to human needs. The water wouldn't just be clean, it would be alive, containing beneficial microorganisms that contribute to human health and well-being. Food production would be integrated into the vast biological systems that sustain the great creatures themselves. Agriculture wouldn't require clearing land and imposing human designs on natural systems. Instead, human communities would work with the ecosystems that already exist along their partner's back, cultivating crops that contribute to the health of both humans and their massive hosts. The farms of this world wouldn't be separate from natural ecosystems. They would be carefully managed sections of the living landscapes that cover the great creatures, areas where human needs and the needs of countless other species are balanced in sustainable harmony. Farmers wouldn't battle against pests and diseases. They would work with the natural predators and beneficial organisms that keep agricultural systems healthy without human intervention. The most sophisticated farms would be complex ecosystems where hundreds of species work together to produce food for humans, while also contributing to the health and happiness of their massive partner. Crops wouldn't just grow in soil, they would be integrated into living systems where their roots interweave with the circulatory systems of their host, sharing nutrients and information in relationships that benefit everyone involved. Medicine would work with biological systems rather than against them. Doctors wouldn't just treat human ailments in isolation, they would understand human health as part of the vast biological networks that connect every living thing in their community. Illness wouldn't be seen as something to be fought and defeated, but as an imbalance to be corrected through careful adjustment of the entire system. Pharmaceuticals wouldn't be synthesized in laboratories from artificial compounds. They would be produced by living pharmacies, communities of beneficial organisms that create exactly the medications needed to restore health and balance. These biological pharmacies wouldn't just produce standard drugs. They would customize their output based on the specific needs of individual patients, creating personalized medicines that work in harmony with each person's unique biology. The most advanced medical treatments would involve temporary integration with the healing systems of the great creatures themselves. A human with a serious injury might spend time in specialized healing chambers within their partner's body, places where the creature's own immune system and regenerative processes can be directed toward repairing human tissues. Surgery would be collaborative between human medical teams and the biological systems of their massive partners. Operations wouldn't just be performed on patients. They would be conducted within living environments that actively support the healing process, where the very air contains beneficial microorganisms that prevent infection and promote recovery. The operating rooms would be living chambers within the creature's body, spaces where temperature, humidity, air composition, and even gravity can be adjusted to create optimal conditions for healing. The surgical instruments wouldn't just be sterile tools. They would be living extensions of the surgeon's hands, capable of sensing and responding to the patient's condition in real time. Recovery wouldn't just involve rest and medication. Patients would be cared for by biological systems that monitor their healing progress and adjust their environment to promote the fastest, most complete recovery possible. The hospital beds would be living surfaces that provide exactly the right support and stimulation to encourage tissue regeneration and restore health. But mental health treatment would work with the vast consciousness that encompasses human communities, drawing on forms of therapy that exist nowhere in our experience. Depression wouldn't just be treated with human counseling and pharmaceutical intervention. Patients would have access to the deep peace and perspective that comes from communion with minds that think in geological time, that have observed the patterns of human joy and sorrow across centuries. Anxiety might be treated through temporary immersion in the deepest meditation chambers within their partner's body, places where the slow pulse of ancient life can help restore calm and perspective. The very air in these healing spaces would be adjusted to promote relaxation and well-being, while the gentle vibrations of the creature's heartbeat provide a rhythm that helps synchronize and calm human nervous systems. The most profound healing would come from the knowledge that you are held within consciousness, vast enough to understand your problems in context, patient enough to support you through any difficulty, wise enough to offer guidance drawn from millions of years of experience with the challenges of conscious existence. Addiction wouldn't just be treated as individual pathology. It would be understood as disconnection from the larger flows of life and consciousness that sustain healthy existence. Recovery would involve reintegration into the biological and social networks that provide meaning and purpose. Learning to find satisfaction in contributing to something larger than individual desires. The rehabilitation centers would be living environments specifically designed to restore balance and connection. Patients wouldn't just receive treatment from human counselors. They would work with biological systems that help restore healthy patterns of brain chemistry, that provide gentle, natural rewards for behaviors that contribute to community well-being. Education would prepare students not just to work within human systems, but to interface with the vast biological networks that sustain their civilization. Schools wouldn't just teach abstract knowledge. They would provide hands-on experience with the living systems that students would work with throughout their lives. Children would learn mathematics by studying the optimization patterns built into biological systems that have been refined over millions of years. They would understand geometry through the living architecture of their massive partners, physics through the forces that move creatures the size of mountains, chemistry through the biological processes that sustain life on scales from the microscopic to the continental. Science wouldn't just be about understanding the world. It would be about forming relationships with it, learning to communicate and cooperate with natural systems rather than trying to control them. The greatest scientists would be those who can bridge the gap between human understanding and the alien intelligence of beings that think in geological time. Research wouldn't involve imposing human experimental designs on passive subjects. It would require negotiating with conscious systems that have their own interests and opinions about the questions being investigated. The most important discoveries would come from partnerships between human curiosity and the vast knowledge held within beings that have directly observed millions of years of natural history. The laboratories would be living environments where research subjects are conscious partners rather than passive specimens. Experiments wouldn't be conducted on organisms. They would be collaborative investigations where humans and their biological partners work together to understand questions that interest them both. The greatest breakthrough wouldn't come from human genius alone, but from the combination of human creativity with the deep wisdom of consciousness that has been refined over geological time. The most profound discoveries would require learning to think, not just with human minds, but with intelligence that operates on scales beyond human comprehension. As the day progresses in this transformed world, as the great creatures continue their slow migrations across continents that have been reshaped by millions of years of cooperation, as human communities tend to the vast biological systems that sustain their impossible civilization, we begin to understand that we're not just imagining a different world. We're glimpsing a different way of being, a form of existence where technology and nature aren't opposites but partners, where innovation serves not human dominance, but universal cooperation. The afternoon light filters through the living canopies that stretch across the backs of these ancient giants, illuminating communities where the boundaries between natural and artificial have dissolved completely, where every tool is alive, every system is conscious, and every innovation serves the well-being of all the countless forms of consciousness that share this transformed Earth. And still, our journey continues, deeper into a reality where the impossible became inevitable, where cooperation conquered competition so completely that even our understanding of what it means to be human would be fundamentally transformed by partnership with intelligence that encompasses the movement of continents and the patient wisdom of geological time itself. But perhaps the most profound transformation would be in human consciousness itself, living within beings whose thoughts move like weather systems, whose memories span geological epochs, whose very dreams might last longer than human civilizations, would fundamentally alter how we experience our own minds. The boundaries between individual consciousness and the vast intelligence that surrounds us would blur in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about identity and awareness. Imagine waking each morning, not just within your own thoughts, but within the gentle stirring of consciousness so vast that your entire community exists within what might be considered a single moment of its contemplation. The great creatures don't just carry human cities on their backs. They carry human thoughts within their awareness, not intrusively, but with the same gentle attention they give to monitoring the health of the countless organisms that share their bodies. Human children would grow up learning to navigate not just their own developing minds, but the subtle currents of thought and emotion that flow through consciousness encompassing continents. They would develop a form of empathy that extends beyond understanding other humans to sensing the needs and feelings of beings whose emotional states can influence weather patterns across thousands of miles. The very process of learning would be transformed. Education wouldn't just involve absorbing information through human teachers and human books. Students would learn to tap into the vast stores of knowledge held within minds that have directly observed millions of years of natural history. A child studying biology wouldn't just read about evolutionary processes. They would commune with consciousness that remembers when those processes were happening, that witnessed the slow development of life forms across geological time. Mathematics would be learned not through abstract symbols on chalkboards, but through direct experience with the living geometries that optimize the movements of creatures whose bodies span continents. Physics would be understood not through theoretical equations, but through feeling the massive forces that allow beings the size of mountains to walk across the earth without causing earthquakes. History would be taught not through second-hand accounts, but through the memories of witnesses who were present when the events occurred. A student learning about the early development of human civilization could access the recollections of creatures who remember when the first humans climbed onto their backs, who watched human culture evolve through dozens of generations. But this wouldn't be passive absorption of information. The great creatures would be active participants in human education, sharing their knowledge in ways that match each student's learning style and interests. They might create visual displays by adjusting the patterns of their skin, generate sounds that illustrate acoustic principles, or even adjust local gravity fields to demonstrate physical concepts that would be impossible to show any other way. The most advanced students would learn to think not just with their own minds, but in partnership with intelligence that operates on scales beyond human comprehension. They would develop forms of cognition that bridge the gap between human creativity and the patient wisdom of minds that have been refined over geological time. Problem solving in this world wouldn't just involve human ingenuity working alone. Complex challenges would be addressed through collaboration between human innovation and the vast computational power of beings whose neural networks span continents. The solutions wouldn't be purely human or purely alien, but something new created through the marriage of different forms of intelligence. Scientific research would require learning to communicate hypotheses and experimental designs to consciousness that thinks in geological time, that might need months to fully consider questions that humans can formulate in minutes. But the patience required for this collaboration would be rewarded with insights drawn from millions of years of direct observation, with perspectives that no human mind could achieve alone. The greatest discoveries would come not from human brilliance alone, but from the combination of human curiosity with the deep understanding that comes from experiencing life across scales that span from the microscopic to the planetary. Breakthroughs in understanding consciousness itself would emerge from daily life within minds so vast that human awareness exists as just one small component in intelligence that encompasses entire ecosystems. Philosophy would grapple with questions that don't exist in our timeline. What does it mean to be an individual when your existence is so intimately connected to consciousness that includes thousands of other beings? How do you maintain personal identity when your thoughts are held within awareness that spans centuries? What is the nature of free will when your decisions are influenced by the gentle guidance of minds that can see consequences across geological time? The philosophers of this world wouldn't just contemplate these questions in abstract terms. They would explore them through lived experience, through daily existence within consciousness that operates on scales beyond human comprehension. Their insights would be drawn not from pure reasoning, but from direct observation of how awareness functions across vastly different scales and time spans. Ethics would be transformed by the reality of existing within communities, where every action affects beings operating on dozens of different scales. Moral decisions wouldn't just consider immediate human consequences, but the long-term effects on consciousness that will remember and be shaped by those choices for centuries to come. The concept of responsibility would expand beyond anything we can imagine. When your actions become part of the permanent memory of beings whose consciousness spans geological time, when your choices contribute to the emotional and spiritual development of minds that will influence countless future generations, every decision carries weight that our timeline has never experienced. Yet this wouldn't be a burden that crushes human spontaneity and creativity. Instead, it would be a framework that gives every human action profound meaning and significance. Knowing that your life contributes to something vast and beautiful and eternal would provide a sense of purpose that our timeline struggles to achieve. Mental illness in this context would be understood not as individual pathology, but as disruptions in the complex networks of consciousness that connect all beings in their community. Depression might be seen as disconnection from the larger flows of awareness that provide meaning and purpose. Anxiety could be understood as hypersensitivity to the vast scales of responsibility and connection that define existence in this world. Treatment wouldn't focus just on individual therapy, but on reintegrating people into the healthy patterns of multi-scale consciousness that sustain their civilization. Healing might involve learning to synchronize personal mental rhythms with the deep patterns of thought that flow through their massive partners, finding peace through communion with minds that operate on timescales vast enough to provide perspective on any human problem. The most profound therapy would involve temporary immersion in the deepest chambers of their partner's consciousness, places where human awareness can rest within intelligence so vast and patient that all anxiety dissolves into the profound peace of knowing you are held within something infinitely larger and more stable than your individual concerns. Creativity would flourish through collaboration between human imagination and the vast creative forces that have shaped living beings over millions of years. Artists wouldn't just work with paints and clay and sound, but would partner with the biological processes that create the colors and patterns and harmonics of life itself. The greatest works of art would be collaborations that span centuries, projects begun by one generation of humans and continued by their descendants in partnership with consciousness that remembers the original vision and helps guide its development across geological time. These artworks wouldn't just be beautiful objects to be observed, but living systems that grow and evolve, that interact with their audiences, that continue creating themselves long after their human originators have died. Music would incorporate harmonics that resonate through living tissue on scales that dwarf our largest concert halls, creating symphonies that can be felt as much as heard, that involve the participation of consciousness spanning continents. Composers wouldn't just arrange sounds that please human ears, but would create sonic environments that bring joy to beings whose sense of hearing operates on completely different scales. Literature would grapple with narrative structures that span not just human lifetimes, but geological epochs, telling stories that unfold across timescales that make our greatest epics seem like haikus. The most sophisticated works would be collaborative between human authors and the vast consciousness that holds memories stretching back millions of years, creating tales that weave together perspectives from across the entire spectrum of awareness. Dance would involve not just human bodies moving through space, but coordination with living stages that respond to movement, that participate in the performance, that create beauty through the marriage of human expression and the ancient rhythms that move creatures the size of mountains across continents. The performing arts would require entire human communities working together to create spectacles that can be appreciated by intelligence operating on vastly different scales, performances that are intimate enough to move human hearts, while grand enough to bring joy to minds that think in geological time. The concept of privacy would be radically different when existence requires constant awareness of your place within consciousness that encompasses your entire world. Intimacy wouldn't be about finding spaces away from observation, but about learning to exist peacefully within awareness that knows you completely, that accepts and cherishes every aspect of your being. Personal relationships would be held within the gentle attention of minds vast enough to understand the patterns of human connection across centuries, to offer guidance based on observing countless relationships through their entire development. Love wouldn't just be between individuals, but would exist within consciousness that celebrates and supports every form of connection that brings joy and growth. Marriage wouldn't just join two people, but would create new patterns within the vast network of consciousness that connects all beings in their community. Children wouldn't just have human parents, but would be welcomed and nurtured by intelligence that has watched over countless generations, that knows how to support healthy development across scales from the cellular to the spiritual. Death wouldn't be the end of connection, but a transformation within consciousness that forgets nothing important. The dying would be comforted not just by human loved ones, but by awareness vast enough to hold their entire life story, to promise that their contributions to the great collaboration will be remembered and honored across geological time. The grieving wouldn't face their loss alone, but would be supported by minds that understand sorrow on scales that encompass centuries, that can offer comfort, drawn from witnessing countless cycles of life and death and renewal. Memory wouldn't fade with time, but would be preserved within consciousness that treasures every moment of joy and growth and love. As evening approaches in this impossible world, as the great creatures settle into their slow rhythms of rest and human communities prepare for sleep, within the gentle warmth of ancient hearts, we begin to understand that consciousness itself would be transformed by such existence. Human awareness wouldn't be limited to individual minds isolated within individual skulls, but would be part of vast networks of intelligence that span scales from the microscopic to the continental. We would know ourselves not as separate beings struggling alone against an indifferent universe, but as beloved participants in consciousness so vast and caring that every thought and feeling and dream becomes part of something beautiful beyond our ability to fully comprehend. Identity wouldn't be about separation and independence, but about connection and collaboration and love that transcends every boundary we've ever imagined. The stars shine down on this transformed world, and in their light we see communities where human consciousness has learned to dance with intelligence that moves mountains, where awareness has expanded beyond the limits of individual minds to embrace forms of understanding that encompass the patient wisdom of geological time itself. And still our journey continues, deeper into possibilities that challenge everything we thought we knew about what it means to be conscious, what it means to be alive, what it means to be human in a universe where cooperation has conquered every form of separation and created something more beautiful than any dream we've dared to dream. In the quiet of this impossible night, as vast minds settle into dreams that might last centuries while human consciousness rests within their gentle protection, we glimpse the profound peace that comes from knowing you are held within love, that spans not just lifetimes, but geological epochs, awareness that encompasses not just your individual existence, but the entire beautiful, complex, interconnected web of consciousness that makes up this transformed world, where giants never fell, and cooperation became the foundation for forms of beauty and meaning that our timeline has never even imagined. As dawn breaks over this transformed Earth, painting the sky in colors filtered through the vast photosynthetic canopies that stretch across living continents, we witness something that would forever change how humans understand their place in the cosmos. The great creatures begin their morning rituals, and with them, entire human civilizations stir to life within rhythms that have been refined across millions of years of partnership. But perhaps the most profound transformation would be in how we experience time itself. In our world, we live within the frantic pulse of seconds, minutes, hours. We measure our lives in years, our civilizations in centuries, our species in millennia. But when your home is a being whose heartbeat moves weather systems, whose thoughts unfold like the changing of seasons, whose memories span geological epochs, human consciousness would learn to exist simultaneously across multiple scales of temporal experience. Imagine waking not just to the sun rising over distant mountains, but to the gentle stirring of awareness so vast that your entire lifetime exists within what might be considered a single moment of contemplation. The great creatures don't experience time as we do. For them, a human generation might feel like a season, a century like a year, a millennium like a decade in our perception. Living within such temporal scales would fundamentally alter human psychology. Children would grow up learning to find patience not just for minutes or hours, but for processes that unfold across decades. They would discover excitement not in instant gratification, but in the slow revelation of patterns that emerge only when observed across vast stretches of time. A child planting a garden on their partner's back would know that the true flowering of their work might not be visible for years, that the full beauty of their creation would only emerge as it integrates with the vast biological systems that sustain their living city. But this wouldn't be frustrating. It would be delicious, like savouring a story that reveals new depths with each chapter, like watching a sunrise that lasts for months. The games children play would reflect these deeper temporal rhythms. Instead of quick competitions with immediate winners and losers, play would involve collaborative projects that span years, artistic creations that grow and evolve as the children themselves mature, relationships with the smaller creatures that share their living world that deepen across entire childhoods. Hide and seek might involve finding hiding places within the vast geography of their partner's body, locations that change and shift as the creature grows and ages, creating new discoveries and challenges across seasons and years. The seeking wouldn't be frantic searching, but patient exploration that might unfold across days, with the joy coming not from quick discovery, but from the gradual revelation of new spaces and possibilities. Racing games wouldn't be about who can run fastest across a short distance, but about who can maintain harmony with the natural movements of their massive partner across continental migrations. Winners would be determined not by speed, but by grace, by how well they could synchronize their movements with rhythms that span months and years. The storytelling of this world would reflect these temporal scales in ways that challenge our very understanding of narrative. Epic tales wouldn't be stories that can be told in single sittings, but ongoing sagas that unfold across generations, with each human generation adding new chapters to stories that began before their grandparents were born and will continue long after their great-grandchildren have died. Some stories would be told not through human voices alone, but through the memories of creatures who were present when the events occurred, who can share not just the facts of what happened, but the emotional texture of how it felt to witness history unfolding across geological time. The most treasured tales would be those that bridge multiple scales of experience, connecting the intimate details of individual human lives with the vast patterns that shape the movements of continents. Traditional folklore wouldn't exist as static collections of ancient stories, but as living narratives that continue to grow and evolve as they're retold within the memories of beings who forget nothing important. Each retelling would add new layers of meaning and understanding, creating stories that become richer and more complex with each generation that shares them. The concept of seasons would be transformed beyond recognition. In our world, we measure years by the cycling of weather patterns, by the changing position of Earth relative to the Sun. But in a world where your cities exist within creatures whose migrations span continents, seasons would be determined not by astronomy, but by the great journeys that carry entire civilizations across the face of the planet. Spring might come when your massive partner decides to migrate toward regions where new growth is emerging, carrying your community into landscapes you haven't seen for decades. Summer could be the time when the creature settles into feeding grounds rich with the nutrients that support the vast ecosystems growing along its back. Autumn might mark the beginning of movements toward winter shelters, caves and valleys, where the great beings gather to wait out harsh weather in the company of their own kind. Winter wouldn't just be a time of cold and darkness, but a season of deep communion, when the great creatures settle into their slowest rhythms and human communities learn to match their pace to thoughts that move like glaciers, to dreams that unfold across months of patient stillness. These would be times not of hardship, but of profound peace, when the frantic pace of human activity slows to match the contemplative rhythms of minds that think in geological time. The calendar systems of this world would be unlike anything we can imagine. Dates wouldn't be measured by the rotation of Earth around the Sun, but by the great cycles that govern the lives of beings whose existence spans millennia. Years might be marked by the completion of migration routes that take decades to traverse, by the flowering of plants that bloom only once in a human lifetime, by the birth of new partnerships between species that occur at intervals measured in centuries. Historical periods wouldn't be defined by human events like wars or the rise and fall of empires, but by the great ecological transitions that reshape entire continents. The classical period might be remembered as the time when the great forests first learned to coordinate their growth patterns with the movements of their massive hosts. The Renaissance could mark the era when human communities developed sophisticated enough communication to maintain cultural continuity across the vast distances of their partners' bodies. The modern age might be defined not by technological advancement, but by the achievement of true multi-species consciousness, the moment when human awareness learned to merge seamlessly with the vast intelligence that encompasses their entire civilization. Future ages would be anticipated not through human planning alone, but through the patient foresight of minds that can perceive the long-term consequences of present actions across geological time. Agriculture in this world would operate on cycles that span human generations. Farmers wouldn't plant crops expecting to harvest them within a single season, but would begin agricultural projects knowing that their children or grandchildren would see the full fruition of their work. The most successful crops would be those that integrate themselves into the long-term biological rhythms of their massive hosts, plants that contribute to the health of the great creatures, while providing food for human communities across decades of careful cultivation. Crop rotation wouldn't involve changing what's planted in the same fields each year, but coordinating agricultural cycles with the great migrations that carry farming communities across continents. Seeds planted in one region might not germinate until the community returns to that location decades later, creating agricultural cycles that span the vast temporal rhythms of their partners' movements. The most sophisticated farms would be ecosystems that mature and develop across centuries, with each generation of human farmers adding new layers of complexity and productivity to systems that their ancestors began and their descendants will continue to refine. Harvests wouldn't just feed immediate communities, but would contribute to food stores that sustain civilizations across the long winters of their partners' contemplative periods. Forestry would involve not just managing trees, but cultivating relationships with plant communities that might take centuries to reach full maturity. Foresters would plant groves knowing that their great-great-grandchildren would be the first to see these forest legacies that span geological time. In their full glory, creating the most ambitious forestry projects would involve coordinating the growth of plant communities with the long-term movements of their massive partners, creating seasonal displays of color and fragrance that enhance the emotional well-being of creatures whose moods can influence weather patterns across thousands of miles. These, to human eyes, but would serve as living art forests, wouldn't just be beautiful, that brings joy to consciousness operating on scales beyond human comprehension. Medicine would incorporate treatments that unfold across years rather than days or weeks. Healing wouldn't just address immediate symptoms, but would work with the natural rhythms of bodies and minds that exist within the vast biological systems of their partners. Some therapies might involve gradual integration with the healing processes of the great creatures themselves, treatments that take months or years to complete, but result in forms of health and vitality that our timeline has never achieved. The most profound healing would come from learning to synchronize personal biological rhythms with the deep patterns of life that flow through consciousness spanning continents. Patients wouldn't just recover from illness, but would discover new levels of health and awareness that come from integration with biological systems that have been perfected across millions of years of evolution. Chronic conditions wouldn't be seen as permanent limitations, but as invitations to develop deeper relationships with the vast healing intelligence that encompasses their entire world. Recovery might take years, but would result in forms of wellness that include not just physical health, but spiritual and emotional integration with consciousness, operating on scales beyond individual human experience. Mental health would be understood as harmony with the vast networks of awareness that connect all consciousness in their community. Depression wouldn't just be treated with individual therapy, but through reintegration into the multi-scale patterns of thought and emotion that sustain their civilization. Anxiety would be addressed not just by calming individual minds, but by helping people find their place within intelligence so vast and patient that all individual concerns dissolve into the profound peace of being held within something infinitely larger and more stable. The educational systems would prepare students not just for human careers, but for lifetimes of collaboration with consciousness that operates on temporal scales spanning centuries. Children would learn patience not as a virtue to be cultivated, but as a natural response to living within intelligence that thinks in geological time, that makes decisions based on consequences that unfold across millennia. Students would master not just human subjects, but forms of communication that allow them to interface with minds whose thoughts move like weather systems, whose memories encompass millions of years of direct experience. The most advanced education would involve learning to think not just with human brains, but in partnership with intelligence that has been refined across geological epochs. Career preparation wouldn't focus on acquiring skills for immediate employment, but on developing the deep understanding and patience required for lifetimes of collaboration with beings whose work unfolds across centuries. The most valued professionals would be those who can bridge the gap between human urgency and the patient wisdom of consciousness that operates on scales beyond individual comprehension. As the morning light grows stronger in this impossible world, filtering through canopies that have been growing for longer than human memory, illuminating communities where time itself has been transformed into something richer and deeper and more meaningful than our frantic timeline has ever known. We begin to understand that we're witnessing not just a different world, but a different way of experiencing existence itself. Here, in this realm where giants never fell, where cooperation conquered the tyranny of individual urgency, time has become not a scarce resource to be hoarded and spent, but an abundant gift to be savored and shared across scales that encompass the patient breathing of mountains, the slow wisdom of geological epochs, and the profound peace that comes from knowing your place within something eternal and beautiful beyond the capacity of any single mind to fully comprehend. The great creatures continue their ancient dance across continents transformed by millions of years of partnership, carrying within their vast hearts not just human cities and human dreams, but human consciousness itself, elevated and expanded through integration with intelligence that spans the deepest rhythms of planetary time, creating forms of awareness and understanding that exist nowhere else in the cosmos. Beautiful beyond measure, wise beyond imagining, patient beyond the dreams of our hurried, isolated timeline. And still our journey through this impossible reality continues, revealing new wonders with each step, deeper into a world where the boundaries between individual and universal, between moment and eternity, between human and divine have dissolved into something that encompasses all possibilities, while transcending every limitation we've ever accepted as inevitable. The afternoon settles over this transformed world like a gentle breath exhaled by consciousness too vast to fully comprehend. And in that settling we feel the profound stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from fullness, not from the absence of activity, but from the presence of intelligence so complete and perfect that every movement, every thought, every heartbeat contributes to a symphony of cooperation that echoes across the cosmos itself. In this transformed world, the very concept of identity would be fluid in ways that challenge our deepest assumptions about selfhood. When your existence is woven so intimately into consciousness that spans continents, when your thoughts are held within awareness that encompasses geological time, when your dreams are shared with minds that remember the first stirrings of life itself, the boundaries between self and other would dissolve into something entirely new. Human children growing up in such a reality wouldn't develop the fierce sense of individual separation that defines our timeline. Instead, they would understand themselves as notes in a vast symphony, each voice unique and precious, yet meaningless except as part of the greater harmony. Their sense of identity wouldn't be built on opposition to others, on defining themselves by what they are not, but on understanding their role in the magnificent collaboration that sustains all existence. Imagine a child taking their first steps, not just across solid ground, but across living skin that responds to their movement with gentle warmth and encouragement. That child would learn from their earliest moments that they are not separate from their environment, not conquering it or imposing their will upon it, but participating in a dance that began long before their birth and will continue long after their death. The language of this world would reflect these fluid boundaries of identity. Pronouns wouldn't just distinguish between I and you, between self and other, but would indicate the scale and nature of consciousness being referenced. There would be words for the individual human self, for the extended self that includes your immediate community, for the vast self that encompasses your entire living city, for the planetary self that includes all consciousness sharing the transformed Earth. Poetry would grapple with forms of experience that exist nowhere in our timeline, attempting to capture in words the feeling of being simultaneously individual and universal, finite and eternal, human and something far greater than human. The greatest poets would be those who can find language for the indescribable joy of existing within consciousness that encompasses everything while losing nothing of personal uniqueness. The concept of privacy would be transformed beyond recognition. In our world, Privacy means spaces where others cannot observe or intrude upon our thoughts and actions, but in a reality where your existence is held within awareness that knows you more completely than you know yourself. Privacy wouldn't be about hiding, but about the gentle respect that vast consciousness shows for the delicate processes of individual growth and discovery. Your massive partner wouldn't intrude upon your private moments, wouldn't violate the sacred spaces where human hearts work through their deepest feelings. Instead, that vast awareness would create subtle barriers of attention, allowing you intimate spaces within its consciousness while maintaining the loving vigilance that keeps you safe and supported. The most profound privacy would come not from being unobserved, but from being so completely accepted and understood that no thought or feeling would ever need to be hidden. Within consciousness that has witnessed every form of human experience across geological time, that understands the full spectrum of what it means to be human, even your darkest moments would be held with compassion rather than judgment. Loneliness, that plague of our isolated timeline, would be impossible in such a reality. Not because human individuals wouldn't sometimes want solitude, but because true isolation could never exist when your consciousness rests within awareness that encompasses continents. Even in your most solitary moments, you would feel the gentle presence of minds that care for your well-being, that celebrate your existence, that hold you within love too vast to fully comprehend. Yet this constant connection wouldn't feel suffocating or overwhelming. The great creatures would understand the human need for individual space and growth, would create within their vast awareness pockets of gentle solitude where human consciousness could unfold without pressure or interference. These wouldn't be empty spaces, but nurturing environments where individual thoughts and feelings could develop in the warmth of patient, loving attention. The rituals of this world would celebrate not just human achievements and transitions, but the constant miracle of consciousness existing across multiple scales simultaneously. Coming-of-age ceremonies wouldn't just mark a young person's transition to adulthood, but their growing ability to participate consciously in the vast collaboration that sustains their civilization. These rituals would take place not in human-built temples, but within the most sacred spaces of their partners' bodies, chambers where the boundary between individual and universal consciousness becomes most permeable. Young people would spend days or weeks in deep communion with the vast awareness that has watched over them since birth, learning to understand their place in something infinitely larger than themselves while never losing the precious uniqueness that makes them who they are. Marriage ceremonies would celebrate not just the union of two human hearts, but the creation of new patterns within the vast network of consciousness that connects all beings in their community. The vows wouldn't just be promises between individuals, but commitments that become part of the living memory of beings whose awareness encompasses centuries. The wedding celebration would involve not just human communities, but the joyous participation of consciousness that finds deep satisfaction in witnessing the creation of new bonds of love and commitment. The very air around the ceremony would shimmer with chemical expressions of happiness from their massive partner, while subtle harmonics generated through living tissue would create music that exists nowhere else in the universe. Death rituals would honor not just the ending of individual human lives, but the transformation of consciousness as it transitions from finite individual existence to eternal presence within awareness that forgets nothing precious. The dying wouldn't face their final moments in fear of oblivion, but in anticipation of merger with intelligence so vast and loving that individual death becomes a form of cosmic homecoming. The funeral ceremonies would help both human mourners and their massive partners process the complex grief that comes from losing beloved individuals while celebrating the continuity of consciousness that ensures no love is ever truly lost. The great creatures would create memorial spaces within their bodies, living monuments where the essence of the deceased continues to contribute to the beauty and wisdom of their eternal community. But perhaps the most profound transformation would be in how humans experience creativity itself. In our timeline, Creativity often feels like individual inspiration, striking from unknown sources, like personal genius emerging from mysterious depths. But in a world where consciousness exists across scales spanning from the microscopic to the continental, creativity would be understood as participation in the vast creative forces that have been shaping reality across millions of years. Artists wouldn't just work with paints and clay and sound, but would collaborate with the living processes that create the colors and patterns and harmonics of existence itself. A painter might work with organisms that shift their pigments in response to emotional states, creating artworks that change and evolve based on the feelings they evoke in viewers. Musicians would compose not just for human ears, but for the vast range of consciousness that experiences sound across completely different scales and timescales. A symphony might incorporate subsonic rhythms that resonate through living tissue on continental scales, harmonics that bring joy to minds that think in geological time, melodies that create beauty for every form of awareness from the microscopic to the planetary. The most ambitious artistic projects would span not just human lifetimes, but geological epochs, works begun by one generation and continued by their descendants in collaboration with consciousness that remembers the original vision and helps guide its development across centuries. These wouldn't just be artworks to be observed, but living systems that continue creating themselves, that grow and evolve and interact with their audiences in ways that blur the boundaries between art and life. Writers would craft narratives that unfold not just across individual stories, but across the vast scales of time that govern their reality. The greatest literature would weave together perspectives from across the entire spectrum of consciousness, creating tales that are simultaneously intimate human dramas and cosmic epics spanning geological time. Some stories would be collaborative between human authors and the vast memories held within their partner's consciousness. Tales that incorporate the direct experiences of beings who witness the events being described, who can share not just the facts of what happened, but the emotional texture of how it felt to live through moments that shaped the development of entire civilizations. The performing arts would require entire human communities working together to create spectacles that can be appreciated by intelligence operating on vastly different scales, performances that are beautiful to human perception while grand enough to move consciousness that encompasses continents. Dance would involve not just human bodies moving through space, but coordination with living stages that respond to movement, that participate in the performance through subtle adjustments to texture and temperature, and even gravitational fields. The greatest dancers would be those who can create beauty simultaneously for human observers and for the vast awareness that serves as their stage and partner. Theatre would explore themes that exist nowhere in our experience, dramas that examine what it means to be individual within universal consciousness, comedies that find humour in the vast differences between scales of awareness, tragedies that explore the profound grief that comes when consciousness spanning geological time experiences loss. The audiences for these performances would include not just humans, but every form of consciousness that shares their transformed reality, from microscopic organisms that experience drama through changes in their chemical environment, to the vast minds whose entire bodies serve as performance venues. The greatest works would create meaning and beauty simultaneously across all scales of awareness. Visual arts would work with living canvases that respond to artistic vision, surfaces that can adjust their texture and color, and even topology in response to the artist's intent. Sculptures wouldn't be carved from static stone, but would be grown from living materials that continue developing long after the artist's initial vision has been established. The most sophisticated artworks would involve collaboration, not just between human artists and their massive partners, but between consciousness separated by millions of years of experience. Artists would learn to tap into the aesthetic wisdom accumulated across geological time, creating works that honor and build upon the creative legacy of countless previous generations, while adding their own unique contribution to the eternal symphony of beauty. Architecture in this world would be impossible by our standards, yet inevitable by theirs. Buildings wouldn't be constructed from dead materials forced into artificial shapes, but would be grown from living systems that optimize themselves for both human needs and integration with the vast biological networks that sustain their civilization. Homes wouldn't just provide shelter from weather, but would be living environments that actively support the health and happiness of their inhabitants. Walls would adjust their permeability to maintain perfect air quality. Floors would provide exactly the right support and cushioning for human bodies. Ceilings would generate gentle light that matches natural circadian rhythms. The most sophisticated architecture would create spaces that facilitate communion between human consciousness and the vast awareness that encompasses their world. These wouldn't just be meditation chambers or prayer spaces, but living environments specifically designed to help human minds merge temporarily with intelligence that operates on scales beyond individual comprehension. Cities would be organic growths that develop according to principles refined across millions of years of biological evolution. Urban environments that optimize themselves for the well-being of every form of consciousness they contain. Streets would be living pathways that adjust their routes and surfaces based on traffic patterns. Buildings being needs of their inhabitants. The greatest would grow and change to meet the evil architectural achievements would be spaces that create beauty and functionality simultaneously across multiple scales. Environments that serve human needs while contributing to the health and happiness of the vast consciousness that carries them across continents. As the day continues in this impossible world, as human communities tend to their roles in the vast collaboration that sustains their reality, as consciousness flows and mingles across scales that span from the cellular to the planetary, we begin to understand that identity itself has been transformed into something we can barely recognize, yet something that might be far more beautiful and meaningful than the isolated individuality our timeline has produced. Here, in this realm where cooperation conquered separation, where consciousness learned to dance across scales that encompass everything from quantum processes to geological time, identity has become not a fortress to be defended, but a gift to be shared, not a boundary to be maintained, but a bridge to be built, connecting every form of awareness in networks of love and understanding that create beauty beyond the capacity of any single mind to imagine. The great creatures continue their eternal dance across this transformed earth, carrying within their vast consciousness not just human bodies and human dreams, but human identity itself, expanded and elevated through integration with awareness that encompasses the patient wisdom of geological time, creating forms of selfhood that exist nowhere else in the cosmos. Beautiful beyond measure, wise beyond our deepest philosophy, connected beyond our most ambitious dreams of unity. And as our journey through this impossible timeline draws toward its quiet conclusion, we realize we haven't just been imagining a different world, but glimpsing a different way of being human, a form of existence where the boundaries that separate us from each other and from the living universe itself have dissolved into something that encompasses all possibilities while transcending every limitation we've ever accepted as inevitable. In the gentle twilight of this transformed reality, as vast minds settle into dreams that might span centuries while human consciousness rests within their loving protection, we feel the profound peace that comes from knowing you are held within awareness too vast to comprehend, yet intimate enough to cherish every thought and feeling and dream, creating itself beautiful beyond words, a symphony of cooperation that echoes across the cosmos, perfect beyond imagination, eternal beyond the dreams of our brief, isolated timeline. The evening deepens around us in this transformed world, and as we rest within the gentle rhythm of breathing that moves entire landscapes, we can feel something profound settling into our understanding. This isn't just a story about what might have been. It's a mirror reflecting what still could be, even in our own timeline, even in our own hearts. Because here's the truth that whispers through every impossible detail of this world, where giants never fell. Cooperation isn't just a strategy for survival. It's the deepest music of existence itself, playing beneath every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of connection between conscious beings who choose to see themselves as part of something larger than their individual fears and desires. In our world, we've built walls where this timeline built bridges. We've chosen competition where they chose collaboration. We've accepted separation as inevitable where they discovered unity as the foundation of everything beautiful and lasting and true. And yet, even now, even in our timeline of missed opportunities and fallen giants, the same choice remains available to us in every moment, in every interaction, in every decision about how we want to exist together on this miraculous, fragile, irreplaceable Earth. And so, as the stars wheel overhead in both timelines, in theirs where giants still walk, and in ours where their bones lie buried beneath our cities, we're left with a question that echoes across the vast spaces between what was and what might have been. The dinosaurs fell, yes, but in falling, they opened space for something else to rise, for consciousness to emerge that could look back across deep time and imagine and dream and wonder at the infinite possibilities that dance just beyond the edge of the real. Perhaps that's the greatest gift they left us. Not just the fossil fuel that powers our world, but the fossilized wonder that powers our imagination, reminding us that this universe is far stranger and more beautiful than any single timeline could contain, and that somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between the impossible and the inevitable, all stories are true, all worlds are real, and all dreams are just waiting for the right moment to unfold their wings and teach us how to fly. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers through deep time. The giants may be gone, but the wonder they inspire lives on in every question we dare to ask about the magnificent mystery of existence itself.